Lights, camera, action. We're talking movies here on Hub Hits today. Why? Well, President Trump is threatening 100% tariffs on movies made for Americans outside of the United States. What does this all mean? Canada has a big movie industry. Just how important could these tariffs be? And how are we funding our own filmmakers and foreign productions here in Canada? To help unpack it all, we go to Joseph Steinberg, Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Toronto. Joseph, great to have you back on the program.
Yeah, great to see you again. Thanks for having me.
Well, let's talk about this, Joseph. We come to you on all things tariff related. What does it mean to implement a tariff on movies? Let's just assume that this is possible. What would the Americans be trying to do by imposing a 100% tariff on the production of movies outside of the United States for American consumers inside the U.S.?
I think the answer here is pretty similar to what President Trump's stated objectives are in implementing things like tariffs on steel and aluminum, on cars. He wants to bring economic activity back to the United States. He wants to bring movie production and post-production that occurs abroad in Canada and many other places around the world back into the United States. I think it's as simple as that. Now, obviously, as you said, there are lots of questions about whether this could be done, and if so, how it could be done.
Yeah. Let's talk, though, about, and again, this may not be popular with some viewers and listeners, but the president may be having a point here that foreign countries, Canada maybe first ranked among them, have gone to great lengths over the years to create generous subsidy schemes to attract U.S. foreign production out of the U.S. into Canada. Tell us about what those incentives are and why they've been so important to bringing movie business north of the border.
Yeah, so Canada has, at present, a pretty thriving movie production business. It accounts for, a little bit less than 1% of Canada's GDP. And that has, again, been growing quite rapidly, double-digit growth year to year in many years over the past little bit. Now, a lot of this is driven by the fact that Canada has pretty large subsidies for these businesses. So the province of Ontario, for example, pays up to, I think, 40% of the wages of people employed in movie production. British Columbia has a really big subsidy, I think up to 30% or so. Alberta has a very large subsidy as well. So governments in Canada are making these kind of big interventions in the market in order to try to prop up and stimulate the growth in this industry. Now, I do think, before I go back to you, I do think it is worth mentioning that Canada is not the only place that does this. In fact, there are big production subsidies in the U.S. as well. California, New York have had long-standing movie production subsidies. The state of Georgia now has a very high subsidy that reaches as high as 30%. So what I see when I look at this is kind of the opposite of a race to the bottom in some sense. A race to the top or to infinity, in the sense that we're seeing these kinds of ever ratcheting upward subsidies in the film production industry to try to attract or retain this kind of activity.
Joseph, to go back to the president's, though, contention, I mean, there is a problem. I mean, California, Hollywood has seen a substantial reduction in the number of movies being made, in the U.S. writ large. This is because, hey, if you're a U.S. production company and you can come north of the border or to the U.K., Australia, or wherever, and access anywhere from 30 to more % off, basically the payroll costs of what I assume, we all know is a pretty kind of still manually intensive industry. You got people running lights, cameras, you name it. This sounds like very distorting of the market and market efficiency, that one would hope that movies would be produced where it was most efficient to produce movies, in one place, one country, or a series of places might become really good at that. And because of market signals, create an industry that allows them to lower costs on their own without government support. So I'm just wondering, what, as you say, a race to the top, what are we racing towards? 100% subsidy on payroll costs
Yeah.
why does that make sense?
Yeah, I really don't think it makes sense. I mean, I think, some people look at this and say, well, the US has these big subsidies, so Canada kind of has to have these subsidies to even compete. But, I look at this kind of thing and I ask, if we're thinking about propping up a particular industry, we have to ask ourselves, what are the particular features of that industry that require distortion in, market activity, government intervention? As an economist, we think about things like externalities, right? Pollution is an obvious one, a negative externality. Education is another one where there's a very strong positive externality. It makes sense for the government to kind of prop up and fund these industries, or in some cases, tax industries that have negative externalities, in order to try to get, the production levels of these things to where we might want them to be, given that private actors are not going to take these kinds of things into account because they don't directly affect them. In the case of movie production, I don't really see anything. I don't really see an obvious positive externality from having a bunch of movie production done in Canada or in the United States when we're thinking about US policymakers' decisions. It just really doesn't seem to be a case where there's a good reason to be intervening. And believing that the market is not going to deliver on the correct allocation of kind of movie production activities across space on its own. If anything, I'll be cynical and say, living in Toronto, downtown Toronto,
Yeah, find a parking spot when there's a movie being shot.
Finding parking around when movies are filming is actually pretty challenging. They cause a lot of congestion.
Yeah.
I've had parking on my street completely blocked off for weeks at a time because of movie production. I see a negative externality, if anything. Maybe not a big one,
Yeah.
but I certainly don't see a positive externality.
So just to wrap this conversation up, I mean, Trump's tariffs have come under a lot of criticism. Understandably, Canadians are, red hot about a lot of his attacks on aluminum smelting, steel, autos. But is this a case where, there may be some things that the Americans are doing that, when we have to respond and negotiate, hopefully towards some kind of stable trading arrangement and agreement, that we might benefit from taking a harder look at what are effectively subsidy irritants across the trading relationship? I think about, subsidization of milk and dairy, of poultry, of film and television. The list goes on and on. The things that often seem to be causing us the problems in the trade relationship are the same things that are causing distortions in our own market. And I don't know, I want to try to be hopeful here, Joseph, but is this an opportunity for us possibly to gore some of these sacred cows and to allow the Canadian economy to become more dynamic as a result of a greater role and emphasis on the market allocating scarce capital to hopefully more productive outcomes on the behalf of everyone?
Absolutely. I look at this situation, that we've see a big opportunity for Canada, in that we have a lot of these policies that, as you mentioned, they really do distort the allocation of resources in our own economy. And they are also, as you mentioned, time and time again being raised as trade irritants by the United States. The movie subsidies, I'll grant that this is a new one, that I've not really heard a big complaint about this from south of the border before, although it is also true that Canada's movie industry has been growing relatively rapidly as a result of these subsidies. But other things like the digital services tax, dairy, these are things that the Americans have been complaining about time and time again under Trump, the first administration, now the second one, but also under Biden in the middle. And at the same time, these are things that Canadians as a whole, perhaps not these specific narrow constituencies that benefit from these distortive policies, but the typical Canadian consumer that ends up having to pay higher prices for these products as a result, or paying higher taxes to support them. would benefit from having these policies eliminated and moving to a more, dynamic market-oriented economy, as you said. And so for the typical Canadian, I see getting rid of these things as kind of an offering to President Trump as a win-win, in that they'll help our own economy allocate resources better. But at the same time, it might help us really get some traction in getting a better outcome in terms of the trade negotiations with President Trump on the things that are really important for our economy. Again, those comes down to autos, steel and aluminum, agriculture, energy.
Yeah, all the places
these are the
where
big ticket items that make a
places where we legitimately
make a huge difference in our economy.
We legitimately have a competitive advantage vis-a-vis other countries. I don't know if movies, we have some fundamental competitive advantage over the UK, Australia, and anywhere else. Just final point, because I know people listening to this conversation are going to say, well, these guys want to take money away from the movie industry. That's going to cost jobs. Isn't it great that the movie industry is as big as it is in Canada? And I think the important thing for people to hear from you, Joseph, is that kind of logic doesn't really make sense, because this is a tax expenditure. So if you're ending the subsidy, what in a sense can happen is that, one, that taxation is not happening to support that subsidy. So you're not extracting money out of the economy and applying it inefficiently or less efficiently than if it had been simply decided as to how that money would be deployed by individual people making hopefully relatively free and open choices about the allocation of their capital. But even more than that, by stopping the subsidy, you might be creating a new industry that is the beneficiary of, the wealth of the country being, again, not allocated by the government in a pre-existing way based on, frankly, probably a lot of politics that's determining which group gets what subsidy, why, and how much.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, you have to recognize that tax dollars are a scarce resource. If we stop spending money supporting the film production industry, it's true that there probably will be fewer jobs in that industry. But at the same time, those are tax dollars that we're not spending there, and that we can either, recoup in lower tax rates overall, or, redirect towards something that's more deserving of tax dollars, in that it has a clearer case in terms of, again, having an externality or something like that. But, these jobs are also not going to just completely disappear. We're not just going to see overall employment decline as a result of a contraction in the movie industry. Temporarily, I would have to imagine that people that work in this industry are going to have to spend some time retraining, and I imagine that the government would be amenable to providing some support for that. But eventually, we see this time and time again. People who work in this industry are going to find jobs elsewhere. They're going to use those same skills in other industries where the competitive case makes more sense.
Yeah, ingenuity is something we each have. It's not something that our employers own or industry owns. It's the potential for each of us to find our own way in the economy. Joseph Steinberg, thank you so much for coming on the program, sharing your analysis and insights on this issue. It's kind of a not super serious, critical one, but it does open up, I think, an interesting conversation like the one we've just had about what are the role of subsidies? Are there some subsidies that should go away? Is this trade negotiation with the United States the opportunity to gore a couple of these sacred cows? Anyway, let's keep the conversation going. Thanks for coming on the program.
Yeah, thanks for having me once again.
That was Joseph Steinberg, Associate Professor at the University of Toronto in the Department of Economics, a regular contributor to The Hub. You can check out all of Joseph's writing for us at www.thehub.ca. Thanks for tuning into this edition of The Hub Hits. Hope you're enjoying these programs. We'll bring you more snapshots of the best thinking and ideas from the Hub's community on this feed as we go forward. Until then, bye-bye.